Good afternoon and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. I'm Sushma Raman, Executive Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session, the first in 2022 in our series Towards Life 3.0, Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century. This talk series draws inspiration from the title of Max Tegmark's book, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. We welcome you back to the series, and it's our honor and privilege to welcome today's speaker, Mathias Risse, who's the faculty director of the Carr Center and a longtime professor at the Kennedy School. His work primarily addresses questions of global justice, ranging from human rights, inequality, taxation, trade, and immigration, to climate change, obligations to future generations, and the future of technology. Mathias will be speaking today on artificial intelligence and the past, present, and future of democracy. After his remarks, we welcome questions from the audience, which you can place in the YouTube chat, and we will draw on some of those questions. Thank you again, and over to you, Mathias.
Thank you, Sushma, for this very kind introduction, and it is exciting to be involved in this series, in this new kind of role that I've not been in since we have started this. So without further ado, let me bring up a PowerPoint and get going on the topic. So as Sushma said, the topic today is artificial intelligence and the past, present, and future of democracy. I should tell you right away, if you are interested in this material, a version of that I've actually also already put out there as a Carr Center discussion paper under that same title a few months ago. So if you Google that, you will find it, and you find a written version, and then you would also see the references to the other authors that I'm making. This is all in there. And this is also part of a forthcoming book that I'm working on called Political Theory of the Digital Age. So let me first of all explain here. So what I'm concerned with here for this talk is to think about and provide some context about the use of specialized AI in democracy. So specialized AI, the kind of thing that already happens in all sorts of devices that you're using, like your smartphone and all sorts of platforms. So basically specialized AI is in machine learning, the kind of software that can learn by itself using suitable data. So that's what's meant by specialized AI, the context specificity and the learning capacity that's characteristic of that. What I'm not here interested in, even though this is a totally sensible, interesting question all by itself, is what would happen to democracy once we have something like a general artificial intelligence. So an artificial intelligence that approximates human capacities along a broad range of domains, and then possibly, so the cliche way of thinking about that is, we are creating something that is smarter than ourselves, and then it will create something smarter than it, and possibly very fast, and this is known as the intelligence explosion. So I'm not interested in that kind of scenario for today, but really more this specialized AI scenario. And so here's the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the general theme of the materiality of democracy, the role that things play, and the really quite decisive role that things play in democracy and have always played in democracy. I'm going to talk briefly about the question of whether democracy and technology generically are natural allies, which will sharpen our attention a little bit to the fact that the answer to that question actually is no. So we really have to be careful, specifically now, what we're doing with AI. I'm going to take a brief look at one rather grandiose way of thinking about integrating AI into democracy, what I call the grand democratic AI utopia, and suggest why that is not a good way of thinking about the future of AI and democracy. And then I'm going to make some suggestions. I'm going to identify some challenges in concrete domains where democracy has to pay attention to integrate AI the right way, because the wrong way of integrating AI is already doing damage all over the place. So that's how we'll conclude. So then on to the materiality of democracy. So again, talking about the materiality of something in this context means to emphasize the importance of things, of objects, material things in the design of human living arrangements. And if you are thinking about particular human living arrangements that way, for example, democracy, that generates very interesting perspectives that are quite different from how we normally think about things, especially also about democracy. So if you are an academic working in democratic theory, or if you're an activist concerned with mobilization, you think of democracy as something very much done by people doing things, by people putting their heads together. So it's very much a focus on people. And of course, there's nothing per se wrong with that, except that there is this material dimension of democracy, namely how we pull this off, how we do collective decision making, how we are democratic depends on a whole lot of material things doing a certain kind of work, and that is not just accidental. Yeah, these things are not just paraphernalia that might as well not be there. They're actually quite crucial to what we can do, and that is a perspective I will develop for democracy also a bit over time. That's why the title is Past, Present, and Future of Democracy. And this is a perspective that has been very much developed in the philosophy of technology literature and the science, technology, and society literature. One key figure there that many of you will have heard of is Bruno Latour, who is known for his actor network theory. This is basically a way of looking at what's happening in life through acknowledging the whole range of entities that play a role in what is happening, including human actors, but then also everything else. So animals involved, but then also in particular every material object whose presence makes some kind of difference. So it's the actor network. Often he talks about actants to have a neutral way of talking about that. So there's this whole fleet of entities, including conscious and organic ones, and non-conscious and non-organic ones, that make a difference in how things unfold. That perspective is also emphasizing the role of things is also present in a classic article in the Philosophy of Technology, Langdon Winner's piece, Do Artifacts of Politics? It's a bit of a provocative title, Do Artifacts of Politics? One might want to say to that, well, of course, only people have politics, or certainly artifacts don't. But in fact, Winner spells this out in quite intriguing ways. So he says there's actually two ways in which we can think about artifacts having political qualities. One way is in which there is specific features of a design of a device or a system that allows for establishing certain patterns of power. So there's a connection between the design of the things or the system and how power is exercised and allocated in society. But there's flexibility in design. So it could go this way or that way. So it's not, the design doesn't, the use of that particular thing does not commit us to any kind of distribution of power. But we have to watch it, how this goes. And then there's other kinds of properties. So another way in which things can have political properties is if actually there's a certain kind of technology that are very strongly and perhaps even unavoidably correlated, linked to certain patterns of power. So an example of the former is a design of traffic infrastructure. This example here, so if you have a highway with low-hanging bridges, as we have them, for example, in the tri-state area, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, that area, lots of low-hanging bridges, then basically you're preventing trucks and buses from traveling those highways. And that means if you can only get from A to B using that kind of highway, and you're depending on the bus, then you don't travel there. The bus doesn't fit there. So the design of traffic infrastructure has an enormous bearing on who gets around who can get around how, and we can simply pay attention to that and design the traffic infrastructure differently. We do have to pay attention. And the other examples, so these are Winner's examples. I might disagree with the examples, but the specific point is still quite valid. So he writes this in the early 80s, and he's very much interested and concerned with atomic energy. He says atomic energy is an example of the second kind, where the use of particular technology then generates downstream consequences for society as a whole that are basically more or less inevitable. So if all our energy input depends on nuclear power plants, then we are committed to turning over a lot of responsibilities to certain elites. People who need to maintain this infrastructure, they become incredibly important. Nuclear reactors are incredibly vulnerable, so we need a certain security apparatus, and if all our energy depends on that, then the security apparatus is pretty central to society. Yeah? So that kind of locks us in. That's an example of the second kind. And this idea that in this way of thinking of what happens in our affairs, in our lives, giving attention to the presence of things and the design relevance of things and the importance of designing things the right way has also been taken up in Europe by Peter Paul Verbeek in particular. He's become quite a prominent thinker also in the regulatory efforts of the European Union, who has written this book called Moralizing Technology. And then in the subtitle is also the idea that there is a morality of things. You know? So things in this actor network way of thinking about things happening around us, they have political qualities, they have a morality. One can debate a little bit how figurative the use of terms is, but in any event, there is a certain point being made that it matters greatly. You know, how it's an enormous, you know, it's paying a lot of respect to people who do design. You know? So the design matters greatly for how societies can unfold. You know? So to transfer this to democracy and to do so right in a historical perspective. So let's distinguish early democracy from modern democracy. Early democracy is something we know from the ancient world. Early democracy is the idea that rulers govern together with either small councils or larger assemblies of people, which then are people who are not directly under the control of the rulers anyway. Yeah? So there's rulers and there's people who are being ruled. And the people who are being ruled one way or another through councils or assemblies are involved in the governing, either by providing information or by possibly assisting with the governance. You know? So that's early democracy. This is a notion I'm taking from David Stasevich's fascinating book, Decline and Rise of Democracy. And this is, by the way, has this kind of nice side effect. If you define democracy that way, then you are thinking of democracy as something that really did exist around quite a number of places around the world, and it's not specifically limited to the Greek context. Now, there is this Western prejudice that democracy is really something that we're getting out of Greece and everybody else did it differently. It's really only Athens and some other places in ancient Greece that invented that. But if you have this definition that Stasevich is using for early democracy, then you have a much broader set of examples of what this might have amounted to. Nonetheless, actually, Athenian democracy is special in its own way, not because it's the only kind of democracy that we have, but because it's an interesting kind of democracy, namely for the kind of materiality that it had, and that already allows me to illustrate this general point that the way things are used, material objects are used in democratic governance makes an enormous difference of how the polity hangs together and might even survive. So Athens had a pretty sophisticated form of governance, different groups of society being pooled together, their competences pooled together in a number of organizations that do the governing. And one critical device, so again, materiality, right? One critical device is the Cleroterion, the allotment machine. You can see a picture of one of those in the background. So basically, this is a 2 by 3 foot slab of rock, which has a grid of deep, thin sludge gorged into it. And with the addition of some other paraphernalia, this is actually a device that allows for random allocation of members of the different groups in Athenian society into the assembly, into juries, into committees where this random distribution matters. So that is doesn't look like much today, but when it was functioning, normally it was a highly sophisticated device, and it was a material embodiment of the fairness involved in allocating power. So an incredibly important piece of Athenian democracy. As was this thing, the clepsydra is the timekeeper, so a visible way of making sure that everybody is getting the same time allotment in assembly to speak. And so that's a number of other objects that play a role in the functionality of Athenian democracy. Again, they're not just paraphernalia, they're not just nice add-ons, and they could have done it, they could have probably done it some other way, but they did it this way. This kind of way meant the actor network system that Athenian democracy was, involving all these things, these material objects, actually was capable of surviving for quite some time. So modern democracy has very different use of materiality. So modern democracy is what we know as representative democracy, and what is typical of modern democracy as we know it is that it comes with mandates that are not strictly binding the representatives to the electorate's will. So we are actually handing over the steering functions of the whole collective to a very small subset of an often large population. We're handing that over to them, and we say, you are entrusted with the governance now. And while we will hold you to account, there's no immediate bindingness to of delegation of will on these people. Modern democracy has two long-standing problems, and that will connect to the materiality in a moment. One is the distant state problem, and the other one is the overbearing executive problem. The distant state problem is that unlike early democracy, in modern democracy, they are large, they have large territories. So how is a person connected? How do the communications, the involvement work? How is the electorate connected to what the elected few are actually doing? Typically, this will require a bureaucracy, and depending on how the bureaucracy is designed, it might take on a life of its own. And so in the end, we do have a democracy, but most people don't really feel like they're much involved with the governance. So that's the distant state problem. And then the overbearing executive problem is that, especially in the kind of presidential version of democracy that we have in places like the United States or France, the powerful might be very hard to rein in. So that's the overbearing executive problem, that the system generates people that it may not be able to control. Obviously, this is an issue we are worrying about rather acutely in the United States right now. So think about what materiality means here and how it has changed over time. So in the early days of the American Republic, we had a capital, right? So the capital was, after some, there were some other capitals before, but then Washington, D.C. was founded. It was the capital. There were elections. There was a president. There was then a White House. And but basically, early on, that system of governance, both Congress, the parliament, and the president, they were basically ruling practically in quarantine from the population because the communication systems really didn't work. So the materiality of the early American Republic, as understood in communications, missives getting around, and information getting around, communication structures, right? That kind of materiality was incredibly poorly developed, and it really required material advances in the newspaper market, these particular kind of objects getting around, and the functioning postal service, which became stronger and stronger throughout the 19th century, so that other material objects could get around. Only then could the early American Republic transform into something that wasn't actually tantamount to a government quarantining from its population. So materiality of early democracy was really a problem. And then increasingly, as the American Republic developed, there were changes in the materiality of democracy, which eventually also led to an improved process in terms of how the electorate got involved with the governance. So if you think about the basic mechanics of democracy, how are we electing people? You all know the word ballot, ballot boxes, and things like that. The word ballot actually is an Italian. It comes from an Italian term. It means ball. It's a little ball. And the early ballots actually were little balls, like you see up there on the left side. And anything that round, really, in the early days of voting, the early days of the Republic, and also in colonial days, often beans and peas were used, sometimes bullets, right? Or people would just raise their hand, depending on how many were involved and whether it could be public or not. So of course that didn't work anymore, even in relatively small city structures. You can't, in 1820 Boston, you can't vote with peas, right? There's just too many people already there, or with beans, so it doesn't work anymore. So eventually in the 19th century, we come to paper ballots. But when you hear paper ballots, so first of all, there's already a step in there, right? So we're no longer literally using little balls, we're using paper. But it's not quite what you think it is. What you think it is on the right side of the slide. Initially, paper ballots really is a piece of paper that somebody brings to the office and writes what they want. And of course, that's problematic in all sorts of ways. Many people can't read and write, right? So they're basically excluded just on the basis of that. So eventually, not everybody has paper. They look very different. It's very messy. So eventually, paper ballots are printed in newspapers. That also has a problem, namely that same problem that people can't read and write. So basically, they are excluded. Then eventually, parties emerge. Parties get boosted through the fact that these ballots are printed in newspapers. So they're putting a party symbol there so that people who like them, want to vote for them, see the symbol. They're cutting out the whole slate of ballots and are voting that way. Which of course then the materiality of that has totally different dynamics, right? So once it increases the power of political parties ipso facto. And so no matter how you do it, there's also possibilities of manipulation and people getting paid for votes. That was totally normal in 19th century United States. And eventually salvation comes from Australia. So the state of Victoria in Australia comes up with a new system, a new way of doing ballots, which then conquers the world it takes a while, so it takes about a century. And the idea here is that the state provides ballots and the state delivers them to particular locations, and there has to be a tranquil place, a separate place where you can actually cast the ballot. Again, completely changed the dynamics because now all these deals are off where you pay me to vote for you because you couldn't control this anymore. So materiality really matters greatly, and of course, we have been agonizing over the materiality of modern democracy ever since. Remember the hanging chats, right? They're looking at hanging chats. And once you see when you all kind of know that, right, these challenges that are coming out of the materiality, so you're not then surprised to hear David Stasevich say modern democracy is an ongoing experiment, and in many ways we should be surprised that it has worked at all. Which brings me then to the point, democracy and technology, are they natural allies? Some people have argued very strongly that they're definitely not. So Jacques Ellul, a famous philosopher of technology of the 20th century, argued for the autonomy of technology. So technology has its own dynamics. It drives everybody along. We are under an illusion that is nourished by the fact that you might be able to control your car, at least in the sense that you can drive it and you know a little bit about your coffee machine. But overall, industry and technology, what Ellul calls technique, have a dynamic of their own, an autonomy of their own, as he says. And basically, we are under an illusion that we control anything, and democracy basically is a charade of sorts. One person who was quite taken by that is somebody you will all have heard of, Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. He was much inspired by Ellul that technology was basically taking over the world, and that we needed to do something about it, basically also on behalf of democracy. Generally, so the competitor to democracy, to both early and modern, is autocracy. And autocracy is so basically the rule of one particular group that did not involve everybody else one way or another. And autocracy has always benefited, has always needed, in order to be enduring, has needed a functioning bureaucracy. So if you think about what motivates democracy, we get democracies when the people who are being ruled are needed. So when you need their participation, and that is typically the case when they have information that you can't get yourself, or if they need to be involved in the enforcement of things. So if you need compliance by the people you rule over, that's typically when you get democracies. Autocracies, of course, are greatly helped by having bureaucracies to rule over everybody, in which case democracies wouldn't emerge. And sophisticated technology greatly helps bureaucracies to be sophisticated, which is why technology in settings where we have a sophisticated autocracy with a sophisticated bureaucracy, technological advancement would normally serve to keep democracy at bay. So where democracy is not already firmly entrenched, technological advances might actually hamper the progress of technology and, of course, of democracy. And of course, that's exactly what happened in China. So what hopes there might have been by anyone in China or China observers that the rise of the middle class would make China more democratic was basically completely thwarted by the new technological possibilities of the last 20 years that were a total game changer for the Communist Party of China. And that is a typical phenomenon that we observe across history, that autocracies are getting more entrenched through technological developments, and often a kind of technological backwardness is actually better to keep democracies functioning. There's a lot of path dependence, but we see a good deal of that. Now, interesting to think in this context about Friedrich August von Hayek's famous knowledge argument for democracy. So Hayek, writing about this for the first time in the 1930s, 1940s, basically says, look, in the 20th century, given the technology that we have, given the kind of industry we have, democracy actually works better for the world than autocracy. And the reason for that is that there's so much knowledge in society that it couldn't possibly be bundled by any social planner or government, right? So this was meant to say, as of the middle of the 20th century, democracy and technology, given the state of the art, were actually sitting quite well together. You know? But that actually, if you think about this, right, so that argument is actually, the Chinese Communist Party just demonstrated to us that that argument is actually no longer valid. Yeah? So massive use of massive deployment of artificial intelligence actually greatly helps autocracies. Yeah? So this argument for democracy might no longer be available. So what overall we find is one should not naively think that democracy and technology are natural allies, right? So in fact, democracy, again, where autocracy is entrenched, technology will tend to help it stay entrenched. At the same time, so the relationship is a little bit perverse. At the same time, it is also clear that modern democracy will never be able to solve the distant state or the executive, the overbearing executive problem without sophisticated use of technology. So democracy badly needs the right kind of use of technologies to stay competitive with autocracy. And that's why the proper use and regulation of AI is so incredibly important. Yeah? Now, one thing one should not have in mind as one thinks about bringing AI and democracy together is what I call the grand democratic AI utopia. So think of you can spell this out in any number of ways, but basically it is about AI being used to collect human preferences in sophisticated ways, to do public services and feed information to people, have sophisticated ways of aggregating information, having access to to our opinions in much more fine-grained ways than the occasional election exercise with ballots could possibly do. So it's AI helping along the aggregation process of the collective will and also the governance process itself. Yeah? So again, you can spell this out in various ways, but this is roughly what I mean by the grand democratic AI utopia. This is not very prominent in the debate, but some people are flirting with that. And I want to suggest that this is a very unhealthy flirtation. It's not something one should be doing for two reasons. There's two problems with this. One problem with this is it kind of suggests that that intelligence comes with it's kind of a one-dimensional thing, and if there's just something more intelligent coming along, it will discover all sorts of smart solutions, intelligent solutions that for some reason we have overlooked. Yeah. So, and the right way of doing politics is just a way of being smarter. But that whole way of thinking about politics really presupposes that that intelligence is sensibly understood as being on one dimension, so that really we can have improvements of intelligence that then ipso facto will improve governance. But that, for all we know about intelligence, for all what intelligence research tells us, is a very naive understanding of intelligence, because intelligence is much better thought of as a multi-dimensional thing rather than a one-dimensional thing. Yeah. And the other problem is that as if you actually do something like that, right? There's always this problem, once you think about an engineering problem. Well, if you think about an engineering problem as such, it might be solvable, but then you also have to embed it into all sorts of other things that happen in society. And here, if we were actually to build something like that, a sophisticated technology that could actually pull off a grand democratic AI utopia, this, of course, would come with so much empowering of particular entities, people, typically companies that build something like that, that it will also create enormous possibilities and enormous levels of power that then can also be abused and can in fact relegate everybody who's not part of the in circle into into brainwashed creatures of sorts. Yeah. So it's always a healthy reminder. George Orwell's 1984 appeared pretty much at the time when all the exciting research that gave us the digital computer with all its capacities, when all that was put into place. And it's exactly then that Orwell writes. He writes very much for an analog world, but that he is writing it right then means he kind of saw the writing on the wall, and we should never forget that 1984 comes from the late 40s again, when all the digital stuff was the basic elements of that were put into place. Okay, then let me, by way of concluding this, let me give these outlooks, how I think we should integrate AI, how we should and should not integrate AI into the materiality of democracy of the future. So AI and democracy, possibilities and challenges for the digital century, which we are clearly in. And so one way of thinking about that is to think of AI like Langdon Winner's traffic infrastructure. So AI has political qualities, just like traffic infrastructure does. In Winner's scenario, and it can go the wrong way. It can keep people off the road, like the bridges did, and it can be used the good way. So how are we designing it the good way? And I want to spell this out in a kind of sketchy way for three domains: the public sphere, and then political power and economic power. Yeah? So for the public sphere, we are seeing these massive changes. So we used to have journalism as a fourth estate, which fourth estate is really kind of a telling term here, right? The media as a fourth estate, they played an important function, hence they are a whole estate. But being an estate, they also had their own agenda, right? That was always an issue. And today, with the way the public sphere works with social media, there is a massive decline of this understanding of media as the fourth estate. So much so, well, my colleague Akon Fung has sometimes referred to this phenomenon of democracy. The current democracy that we have is wide aperture and low deference. So that's a very different model from the media as a fourth estate kind of understanding of democracy. And of course, this is an understanding of the public sphere where we have the information business is largely taken over also by private sectors with even more of a personal agenda than the fourth estate, the media people used to have. So the people who are running the public sphere, the social media driven by platforms that are serving some people's financial interests. This has become a public sphere very much driven by the monetary interest of the private sector, and also one that is easily hijackable for all sorts of negative misinformation, disinformation campaigning. So clearly, our public sphere currently is in bad shape. Is the bad kind of traffic system in Langdon Winner's sense. But there's things we can do about that. Media scholar Ethan Zuckerman has coined this fascinating term, digital public infrastructure, which you should Google. He has written a couple of really intriguing pieces about that. So instead of what we have right now, which is a public sphere driven by private interest and easily susceptible to disinformation, misinformation, we should create a digital public infrastructure which is doable in at least two different ways, namely through a highly decentralized situation where a lot of local local digital devices are being used. So it's like basically transferring the idea of a public park online, something locally accessible, so a lot of local hotspots of information and deliberation sharing, or something at the more centralized level, like the BBC in the UK, or there's a German network. So the idea that there is centralized but still independent of the state sort of media structure. Yeah, something that was not done in the United States. But in either of these two ways, could we have a digital public infrastructure? And that would involve necessarily a lot of specialized AI, and that would be the better kind of traffic infrastructure. In the political power domain, so the problems here, you all know about the Chinese social credit system, right? So this massive system of governmental control. The Chinese have it. Of course, we know in the United States, we also have it. Snowden revealed this to us years ago, right? That there's an enormous amount of surveillance going on. So there's a lot of centralization, a lot of possibilities of centralized state power here. We also see, and people like Ron Dybert at the Citizens Lab at the University of Toronto have drawn much attention to these phenomena. We see that cyberspace is becoming a battleground between ever more strengthened state power and ever more sophisticated cybercrime activities, which then leads to the development of all sorts of software that then can also be sold to oppressive regimes. Think about how did Belarus intercept planes with the opposition politicians on it, things like that, right? So there's a political power benefits enormously from the possibilities of specialized AI to increase surveillance and possibilities of interception. There is also quite a range of positive examples. I'm not going to go through them in any detail since I realize I'm starting to run short on time here, but you find a lot of examples in places like Iceland. Taiwan has become quite Audrey Tan, famous digital infrastructure minister in Taiwan. France has used that. Barcelona as a model piece of a smart city, using smart cityness in democratic ways. California report cards. So all these are fascinating examples of how grassroots movements have actually often grassroots movements, but then also democratically minded, more centralized forces have actually deployed specialized AI and the kind of platforms that can be built with them in order to enhance democratic empowerment. So the relevant knowledge for this exists, but we really have to be careful, because the default here will be that the distant state problem and the overbearing executive problem are getting solved the wrong way. And namely, the state becomes ever more distant, doing ever more its own thing, and possibilities of power seizure of the executive becoming ever stronger. So this, I think the only way in which this could be prevented is a strong grassroots interest in how these technologies can be used for democratic purposes. And then finally, in the economic domain, there have been a lot of wake-up calls about capitalism going wrong, and the most famous of them are Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, and Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. But Piketty points out to us that capitalism naturally increases inequalities, and Shoshana Zuboff points out that in the present age, the mechanism for that is a massive amount of surveillance. Yeah? Now, positive scenarios here are also available. So many economists who think about, in fact, the mainstream view among economists thinking about the future of work is actually in tendency optimistic, right? They say a lot of ugly aspects of jobs are falling away, not many jobs per se, well, some jobs per se also, but by and large, the nature of jobs is going to change. And overall, this can have very positive tendencies. Yeah? But there's, of course, a pessimistic scenario, namely the pessimistic scenario is that more digitalization will actually mean that large parts of society are no longer needed at all to the creation of wealth. And one should not actually entirely see this scenario off, because if you think about how economies have worked in the past, so if you think about when ownership was driven by who was owning land, they needed people to be tenants of land, right? So in a way, the whole point of land ownership was that you have people renting it from you, right, and producing things there for you. So not too many of them could die. So attention needed to be paid. When ownership was determined by industry, again, the people who owned the factories needed people to work there. They also needed people to buy stuff. So again, not too many people could perish or disappear from the system. But in principle, it is not impossible that in the future, the gloomy scenario comes true, where many people are simply no longer needed in the system, because everything is too much is turned over to automatization, and much wealth lies in data ownership, which of course is a hugely important topic, how we actually think about data ownership. And of course, it is very troubling that much of the dynamics in the economic sphere here comes from these massive companies in the United States and China. One way or another, in order for the positive scenario to come true, these would need to be reined in, right? Most likely through actual dismantling but possibly also through a substantially strengthened regulatory effort of the sort that the European Union has been pursuing quite aggressively. So with that coming to an end, modern democracy does very much depend on the right use of technology. We could never solve the two legitimacy problems, the distant state and the overbearing executive problem, without using the right kind of technology. We do need contemporary technology. That means specifically specialized AI. And of course, there is vast potential, right? So in a way, the sky is the limit. There's a lot we can do, but we should not think it is falling into place naturally. Technology, so there's nothing inherently democracy enhancing about technology. In fact, on the contrary, they're not natural allies. So it needs insistence from the bottom up and creativity and input from the bottom up to make it happen. And only that way will we be able to transform, to have a future of bringing democracy and technology together that is like the good kind of traffic infrastructure that Langdon Winner had in mind, rather than the bad kind that excludes too many people. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Matthias. That was fascinating. We welcome questions from the audience, which I'll call on in a minute, but I wanted to start with a more basic question, which is your definition of technology, because you've used a range of examples from ancient times, but also more current day situations that, a lot of us might think of social media, for example, or corporations like Google when we think of technology. So could you share for our audience a definition of technology that encompasses the examples you gave, for example, with Latour?
Yeah, a good question, and actually a surprisingly difficult one. So one thing that you'll pick up pretty quickly when you venture down the corridors of the philosophy of technology, or the neighboring area, science, technology, and society studies, is that there isn't really a commonly shared definition of technology, and that isn't because well, let me put it positively. The reason for that is there's a complexity of phenomena here, right? And it happens really at three layers, and which means then there's these three meanings of technology, really. One layer is machines, actual devices, ranging from rather simple things like my glasses here to more sophisticated things like my iPhone here, and then much bigger things, right? So actual machines. That is one meaning of technology. A second meaning of technology is we talk about like the technology of e-voting, for example, and that means the human use of devices. So the second meaning of technology is actual human practices of integrating things into their lives. And then the third layer is so in a way etymologically closest to what the word actually means in Greek, is actually the knowledge of something, right? It's the knowledge of all these things. So it's the devices, the practices, and the knowledge that gives you this package. But that's about as neat as I can put it, what is meant by technology.
So you outlined quite, thoroughly in a short period of time some of the challenges we face in the public sphere, as well as on the political and economic power domains. And earlier you talked about, this issue of needing technology, needing a strong democracy before we really think of kind of bringing in technology, because otherwise you're not going to have that foundation. So given where we are in the United States today, do we invest in ensuring that technology is more responsive to these patterns of power and, helping facilitate democratic engagement? Or do we invest further in democracy, civic education, citizenship, voting rights, etc.? What is your take on this?
Yeah. So first of all, on the general picture there. So how friendly are how friendly is democracy, is technology to autocracy? How friendly is technology to democracy? Again, a kind of a basic thing to understand there is if you look historically at when have democracies emerged. Yeah? So when could at least a subpopulation of the larger population assert that they needed to be heard. They were ruled over, they got that, but they needed to be heard. That would happen when the rulers couldn't get away with doing the ruling by themselves. You know? So they needed information, they needed to understand what people owned, how valuable the land was, how they made a living. They needed to have that information, or possibly, weak state phenomena. They actually needed the ruled to believe in the quality of the ruling. So it's a situation like that when we get democracy. And from that, you can see if the rulers have access to a sophisticated technology, then this kind of need is not there. So if they have a sophisticated bureaucracy that uses particular devices and bookkeeping and things like that in order to understand the wealth of society and to exercise control, then democracy might not emerge. Yeah? And something like that is really the Chinese story, right, which has always had a very strong bureaucracy. And so these tendencies towards democratization never really got going there. And then if you on the other side, of course, if you have an already strongly entrenched democracy, and of course that is one thing we do have in the United States, where there's a basic democratic mentality. Whatever you think about weapon ownership in this country, right? I mean, it's an expression of the democratic mentality that the people who are ruled over are reminding everybody else that they are nothing to be laughed at, right? They need to be taken seriously, right? And so we do in the United States, we do have the strong democratic, the strong democratic streak, mentality. And then, of course, if technology comes in, it doesn't have this effect, that it doesn't have this automatic effect of undermining democracy, a sort of path dependency here. But of course, we do need to worry, right? So that over time, democracy gets worn out, and we need to worry about that, especially right now when we, live in these Orwellian times, when fealty in the Republican Party is defined around a commitment to the fact that the election was stolen, right? And so once you have times like that, then we have to worry that the wrong kind of person in power would actually be able to enlist sophisticated technological devices to strengthen their rule. So this would be kind of as a part of changing parameters. So what do we need to do there? Well, we need to, as you suggest, we need to work on both ends, right? So the democratic alertness we really need to think hard what we can do in order to keep democracy alive. And we need to do that, especially, how can we harness technology for that purpose? And often, some of the examples one could think of here are just local things that happen in American cities and American states. So there's a lot of initiatives in California, also in Vermont. So there's a good pool of best practices to draw on. But this needs to involve a lot of people in order to use technology in order to get at these two legitimacy problems of democracy and the distant state and the overbearing executive problem.
So we have a few good questions. John Shattuck asks whether the principal function of AI in reinforcing democracy is the principal function of AI in reinforcing democracy to obtain and analyze participants' preferences, or are there other functions as well?
Well, great question. So think about what specialized AI is, right? So this is really there's a broad range of things that can do. It just really means machine learning, so a kind of software that uses data in order to learn by itself. And so we find that deployed, of course, in platforms, in handheld devices. So they all use specialized AI of sorts in order to become more responsive to what the user wants or what the collective of user wants, because it is actually learning something. Cliche example is your movie recommender system, which learns something from you, brings data in from people like you, and then you can think then this can specialized AI, how it can enter into improving democracy. can mean a number of things. It can be used, and there was this one slide that I had that went way by too fast. But in France, they had a deliberation at a national scale where actually specialized AI came in order to structure and to gather the preferences, and that went over several stages. So it actually mattered that it was AI. So the AI learned from the data bank, came in and changed it, and did that at great speed. There is in Vermont, there's an internet platform that is limited to people who live in Vermont, that is also limited to them posting only once a day, so that things are kind of cooling down. So this is actually something quite pedestrian, right? That doesn't even require anything especially sophisticated. Some of this can also be done with this is more like a wise use, democratic use of internet rather than specialized AI. But it happens. It can happen in this whole range of involving participation, bringing out participation, improving deliberation, also improving public services. So there's a whole separate debate that one line of complaint about the use of technology, and especially the kind of self-learning mechanisms of AI, is that it increases surveillance and control of states, but better delivery of services through the learning possibilities, more targeted delivery of services through the kind of abilities that specialized AI have. That too is something that will increase, if used the right way, will increase people's belief in what democracy can, that it does not take a strong man, right? But the public service delivery under democracy is also functioning well. So it's this whole range where it can be deployed.
So quick follow-up question, which is that in corporate kind of marketing situations, there's this trend in effective computing to use it to influence, consumers' behaviors and preferences and future thoughts and actions. Do you see that emerging in this domain, following up on John's questions of how governments use AI in democracy, with not just analyzing people's preferences, but also trying to influence future decisions or preferences?
Well, so I mean, obviously, in the private sector, this is already very much done. So my movie recommender system example is something that many of us encounter all the time. And of course, marketing has discovered marketing is always on top of technology. So how to figure out what to present to whom, and how to figure out what people are interested in. So obviously, there's a lot of possibilities for manipulating people. And Shoshana Zuboff coined the term surveillance capitalism to point out that basically this kind of thing, right, that people are being screened, surveyed, data are collected in order for future marketing, that is so important in the present age that the whole period of capitalism is named, and she wants to name it after that, surveillance capitalism. And that is, of course, then both about targeting products to specific people who might be interested in them, but then even at a more grandiose scale to actually shape trends. So if I can influence particular people, I can influence a lot of people, and then I'm shaping a trend. So that is, of course, very much happening already. And in order to make sure, of course, then there's pros and cons to this. A lot of people say, isn't this fantastic? And they're eager to have possibilities of Amazon sending stuff to them that they haven't even ordered. But once they see it, they say to themselves, I should have, and I would have ordered this had I thought of it. So some people think this is just amazing. But then one has to worry, of course, the extent of data collection and who is in control of that. And so here I'm not just a citizen of, but a big admirer of the European Union, right? So there's a completely different approach to data handling, privacy regulation, where the state act or the European Union actively says to the company, here's how you need to do things, as opposed to the American way, where basically companies explain to their users, here's how this will work, and if you need to check this here and check this there, and in between are these 50 pages that you need to read in order to make an informed call, which of course is kind of silly. So I think here we need a lot of regulatory effort. And we need a lot of citizens' interest in that, so that there's this dimension of public control as much as that can be possible, so that we are not just leaving it to the private sector to shape. I mean, they're eager to shape the future anyway, and we have to make sure that it is not just the people who Mark Zuckerberg and the likes of him that shape our future.
So there are a couple questions from Bob Wyman, and I'm going to combine them, and then perhaps you could also share some closing thoughts and reflections, as well as if there's any recommendations that you might have for folks in terms of additional reading, or I know you're a big movie buff, any movie recommendations. So the first question is that, if he spent his entire career thinking that by developing internet and communications technology, he was building the infrastructure for democracy, and is that a mistake? And if the second question is, if private companies are providing what were once public functions, and given that private forums increasingly dominate public discourse, would we be better off if public forums were government run? This connects to your public infrastructure point, I think. Yeah.
So first of all, Bob, no, you did not make a mistake. And I want to come back to the the positive part of what I was talking about earlier. So modern democracy has these two legitimacy problems. Yeah. So the distant state and the overbearing executive problem. That's inherent in what modern democracy is. And this, I mean, in a way, it's kind of a crazy thought. What modern democracy is, that we just delegate the ruling over all of us to a very small subset of the population. And we just kind of entrust them with that for a number of years, and we only, it's only several years later that we get to hold them accountable again. It is a crazy thought. It can work. Yeah, it can work if we can solve, in particular, these two legitimacy problems. That the distant state, that the state and with its machinery, its bureaucracy is so far away that I, as an individual, really no longer have any reason to think that I'm involved, and that this is doing anything on my behalf. And the other problem is that the executive becomes incredibly strong through the bureaucracy, the machinery that inevitably we need in a large territory. And so these two problems, and the reason I called this the positive part, is these two problems really can only be solved through the right kind of use of technology. And just like my example of what happened in the early American Republic, people in DC were in complete isolation. They had no idea what was happening in Massachusetts, that far up in the north, because there was no the communications network, in a way, the materiality of the time, or the technology of the time, postal services and newspapers, with everything that's connected to that, printing presses and carriages, the technology of the time. Eventually, that was there. And then it created something better than it was at the beginning. There's lots of issues, obviously, but something better than it was at the beginning. And so that was a way of addressing these problems. And so that makes the general point that, yes, we badly need technology in order to solve these problems. And anybody who has contributed to providing this technology, needs to be thanked for having invested their efforts in this way. And now the challenge is, right, that again, it's like the Langdon-Winner kind of traffic infrastructure, that we are now, it requires continuous vigilance. When we have produced something, we have created something that can, like also in the scenario of the future of work, that can create a scenario where people have a lot more leisure time and they are much better educated, because technology was used for that already. And so there is this possibility, and it is not entirely off the radar. But we just have to be watchful, because possibilities of centralization, power grab, think about industry development in the tech business. Now that we have these companies these days, that the IT companies are so much more powerful, way bigger than the energy companies of old have ever been. So it requires this continuous vigilance and involvement to make sure that we actually maintain these democracies. And yeah, about the would it be better if they were publicly owned? So What I want to say to that, I really can see these different ways of going there. So I'm not prepared to make this very strong commitment that it needs to be publicly owned. What I want to say is there's institutional possibilities that we actually know from other domains. So the history of broadcasting is quite striking here. It was handled in the United States in a highly decentralized way, which is why there's no BBC. There's never been a BBC in the United States. It was solved in the UK in a different way. There was a BBC. There is a BBC, even though now Boris Johnson is very eager to get rid of that, right? So it could be something like that, a BBC model. It is at the centralized level, but it's not controlled directly by the government. That is one way in which there's a public institution, but not controlled. Like we have central banks and things like that, right? So kind of independent, but still centralized. And then we have this massive decentralized, a possibility with lots of local networks. That's kind of the competing model to that. Either way, it would require a lot of state regulation. So again, this is how I'm a fan of the European Union, right? A lot of willingness to experiment with regulation. That I think we do need. A good movie to watch about this, Sushma. I don't know, but it's a good movie to watch. Let me maybe just say, so all the references that I made, if you're interested in any of that, and there's a whole range of authors that I mentioned just in passing, Jacques Ellul and Akon Fang and Ethan Zuckerman, many others. Please do look up the paper. It's easy to find. It's a Carr Center discussion paper under exactly this title. And so then you see all the people that I know, you can also know that way.
Terrific. I feel like we could continue this discussion for another hour, but our time is up. So thank you, Mathias, for your really insightful remarks. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks, meeting with Tina Kempen-Reuter, who is the director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Alabama in Birmingham and a former Carr Center fellow. And she's going to be talking about human rights and the smart city. So thank you all.